Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Falcons Central Radio on the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, and as usual, I am joined by Matt Karoly. Today, we are going to be talking about the Falcons' Week 16 win over the Carolina Panthers. We'll be talking about their upcoming Week 17 matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and as usual, we will be answering your mailbag questions. Usually, we start the show off with a roster move, but just because we just came off of the holidays, want to ask you, Matt, how was your holiday?
It was good, man. It was relaxing. I took off from work on the Friday before, so I had a nice 5-day weekend, just relaxing at home, watching football, eating some good food. So how was yours?
It's good, man. I still have off. I have another week off, basically. I
Lucky
have to go
you.
back to work till next Thursday. That's when school starts up back here. So I'm gonna enjoy even more leisure time over the next couple of days. So watch some bowl games, and freak out probably on Monday when stuff is happening elsewhere in the league, maybe even in Atlanta. But maybe we'll talk a little bit about that type of stuff when we get to the mailbag questions. But let's jump into this Falcons Panthers game. Falcons got a nice little win from the Panthers over the Panthers. I think we would both agree that not having Cam Newton in the lineup was certainly helped the Falcons out. But I think they played one of the better games that we've seen them play. And this Panthers team, even without Cam Newton, is no pushover. And we saw the Falcons be able to take care of business in a lot of areas. Their running game was very effective against a stout Carolina Panther run defense, thanks to their big plays. They had some explosive plays in the passing game, and their defense was able to be opportunistic and create some turnovers on that side of the ball. So a pretty complete game for the Falcons. You even got a great special teams play from Matt Bosher, where he cleaned Kenyon Barner's clock. I don't necessarily know if the special teams overall was great, but that certainly was a highlight play. So a pretty complete game from the Falcons against this Carolina team. Matt, what were some of your thoughts from watching last week's game?
Yeah, so first, offensively, I thought they were very explosive. They didn't get many plays in this game. They were in the low 40s, which isn't typically a good thing, but they had 8 explosive plays by my count. And just to put that in the context for people, the better teams in this league this year, the Chiefs, the Chargers, and the Rams in that category, typically are averaging 7 explosive plays per game. So Falcons being right up with them, if not better, with 8. I thought that was pretty impressive. And 5 of them came in the run game. And I think that had a lot to do with the explosiveness. When you're balanced and you can able to generate explosive plays in the run game, I think that just further opens up this offense. And, for the last 3 weeks now, averaging over 100 yards a game, 172 to be exact. That's kind of what we've been looking for, is that type of performance from the offense, and they're now consistently doing it. Now, again, against inferior teams, but the Panthers did come in there with one of the top 10 DVO ranked run defenses. So we didn't think that they had this in them against the Panthers, but they proved us wrong, and it was good to see. So, that was my one takeaway from the offense. As far as the defense, it was a bend but don't break type of performance. When the offense only has 40-some plays, that means the defense is probably on the field for quite a bit, and they were, on the field for, 83, I think, something like that. So, but the big thing, and you mentioned it, the opportunistic nature of this defense, the fact that they generated 4 takeaways, I mean, that's kind of what Dan Quinn preaches. And, it's something that we talked about. What's the identity of this football team? I think the last 3 weeks have kind of showed that. Forcing turnovers on defense, getting the offense more opportunities at the ball, and then, on offense, taking advantage of those turnovers, generating the big plays. So, I mean, those are my biggest takeaways from this game. And, the last 3 weeks is just we're seeing more what this team was set out to do at this season, as far as, again, creating turnovers and generating the big plays. And, we've seen it the last couple of weeks, and hopefully they can finish strong with another one in Tampa Bay.
Yeah, you look at Carolina had multiple scoring opportunities in this game, in addition to the ones that they did score on, and just couldn't take advantage of it, in part due to the Falcons being able to create some turnovers when with the Panthers sort of deep in their own territory, or deep in the Falcons' territory. So I think that was a big part of it. and a couple of times where just, not having Cam Newton out there probably also led to some execution errors for the Panthers. So I think the Falcons defense, while they did do some positives in this game by creating those turnovers, I think overall this was a game where I think Carolina basically drew up exactly the game plan that they wanted to execute in this game and just couldn't take advantage of the opportunities that they had in this game. So you could probably play this game a couple more times and it wouldn't necessarily go in the Falcons' defensive favor. But we at this point in the season, we got to take what we can get. For most of the season, the Falcons have had the 32nd ranked DVOA rated defense. From what I checked at Football Outsiders, they have now moved up to 29th, so they are no longer in the bottom three. So I will take that as a small victory. And if this game, and I think it did, contributed to them moving up in the rankings, then I will take it.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the only other point that you could add that I didn't talk about with the defense is, I think the defensive line played well. They got pressure pretty much from every, guy on that line except for maybe Vic Beasley. But again, that's a fair point. If Cam Newton was in that game, are they getting those types of pressures, or is Cam, kind of eluding that rush and creating some big plays? Because we've seen that in the past. But, again, I think some credit does need to be given because earlier on in the season, we weren't getting this type of effort. They weren't taking advantage of matchups that were in their favor as far as, Marshall Newhouse being the left tackle in that game. I thought Takk McKinley took advantage of that matchup the way he should. So that was encouraging to see, and he was kind of one of my bigger standout performers. Just we were looking for a type of performance like that, excuse me, from him, and he delivered on that and was a big reason why I think some of those turnovers were forced in that game.
I'm sorry. I just took a peek at the chat, and Charles McDonald made an interesting comment that made me laugh. But yeah,
the Facebook chat.
No, the YouTube chat.
Oh, didn't even realize Charles jumps on the YouTube like that.
Yeah, well, I don't think he normally does, but today he decided
to shout out to Charles,
make an exception. Yeah. So, do you have a brother of the week? And for those of you guys that aren't regular listeners and viewers, that is the person who did the most for the team, but won't necessarily make the headlines that some other people would.
I kind of just spoke about him. I think I'd go with Takk McKinley. Like I said, we've been looking for that type of effort from him the last couple of weeks. He's been quiet, and I think he capitalized on an opportunity going up against a favorable matchup, and really all day was pressuring Taylor Heinicke, and might not necessarily show up on the stat column. I mean, he only had a half a sack, but he had, a bunch of pressures, bunch of hurries, hits on the quarterback. So, I think I'm going to go with Takk McKinley.
I'll go with Sherrod Niesman. I think this was one of the better games that he's had. I thought it was interesting that the Falcons didn't decide to have Deion Jones shadow Christian McCaffrey in this game. They used a healthy mix of a bunch of guys, including Niesman, Olakun, DeMonte Casey, Jordan Richards, as well as Deion Jones. Deion Jones drew the bulk of the assignments when the Falcons manned up to Carolina from what I saw. But I thought Niesman did a good job in this game. And, one of the issues with Niesman throughout the season has been sort of not he plays with a lot of energy, a lot of effort. He plays, that balls to the wall style. But he makes a lot of mental errors, and that leads to some missed tackles and whatnot. And so it's a little bit up and down. You see things that you like from him, but you also see things like he needs to clean up. And I think this game was probably the most complete performance we've seen from him to date. So, if this is sort of, part of his resume to be the top backup to Keanu Neal next season, and I think him and Jordan Richards will both be back on the roster next year, competing for that spot in next year's training camp. I think this was a good performance to sort of allow him to sort of potentially put a button on this season. And obviously there's one more game left to be played, but certainly a strong sort of resume builder for him, potentially to maintain his roster spot in 2019, which he, for some reason that I think both you and I sort of have questioned why they chose to get rid of him last year. But I don't think that will be the situation again next year.
Yeah, I certainly hope not.
All right, let's move on. Talk Falcons Bucs. Unless you have anything else to add about the Falcons Panthers game.
Nah, let's go on to the Bucs game.
All right. So this is the season finale. The Falcons are facing a Bucs team on the road. This game potentially has ramifications for NFC South placement. If the Falcons win, then they get second place, regardless of what else happens. If they lose and Carolina wins, somehow finds a way to beat the Saints, then the Falcons will finish in third place. Because I think pretty much the Bucs are. There's no way that the Bucs can leapfrog them in the standings, but again, these are all tiebreaker issues that I don't necessarily want to.
It's divisional record first, right? So Bucs, what do they got? The Saints they beat, and they beat.
I think they would
Panthers.
both be. If the Falcons lose, I think we would both be 3-3 in the division. Last I checked.
And then at that point, it goes to conference record, and I think the Falcons already have them beat on conference record. If I'm not, last I checked, but
it might be common games before conference record. I think, but either way,
I thought it was conference record first. But I guess the one thing though that's interesting, because I was looking at, again, been monitoring draft position. If the Falcons do lose this game, there's a good chance that they can be the 5th overall pick. Now they need some help with some teams losing games. That who's the one that jumps out? I want to say the Bills. The Bills need to beat the Dolphins, which is, I think, possible. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the craziest thing, that they can finish still in like 3rd in the NFC South with a loss, but can be ahead of the Bucs with the 5th overall pick. So that's something that I'm sure some fans will get excited about if they do lose. But
yes, I know many people will be logging on to tankathon.com at like 4:03 p.m. On Sunday and whatnot. So we'll see what happens. This game is going to be interesting because you got you got potential injuries for the Falcons. Julio Jones is dealing with a ribs and hip injury. We assume he's going to play because he was dealing with similar issues last week and played. But you never know. It sounds like the team is a little bit more optimistic about him playing on Sunday than they are with Tevin Coleman or Wes Schweitzer. Coleman's dealing with a groin injury, Schweitzer dealing with a back injury. Both of those guys at this point in the week are questionable. I guess we'll find out tomorrow sort of what their status is going to be. The Bucs are dealing with not as many sort of major injuries. The one prominent one is Deshaun Jackson. I'm sorry, Deshaun Jackson, who's dealing with a foot injury, in addition to just not wanting to play for the Buccaneers anymore, which I think everybody has known probably for like 3 months that's been the case since he first came up with. I think he asked for a trade at the deadline, but anyway, I remember that being the thing back in like week 7. Mm-hmm. But this game is going to be interesting because given those injuries, it could affect some of the matchups a little bit. Particularly, I think the one matchup that stands out to me is sort of losing Wes Schweitzer on the interior, and that would potentially mean that Ben Garland's going to be their starter at left guard. And, the Bucs have Gerald McCoy still. I know he's not necessarily the same Gerald McCoy that he was a couple of years ago, where he was arguably, the Aaron Donald before there was an Aaron Donald in the league. But Vita Vea has come on strong the last couple of weeks, and I think that interior of the Bucs defensive line could give this Falcons interior offensive line some problems if those guys can get going, and then that interior pressure could be very disruptive for Matt Ryan trying to find his playmakers on the outside, in addition to limiting the Falcons running game. Particularly when you throw in the fact that Tevin Coleman might be limited in this game. So that, to me, is going to be one of the key matchups, that if the Bucs can find a way to take advantage of that and just sort of cave in this Falcons offensive line, that could throw a major wrench into anything the Falcons do offensively. And we know that given how the Bucs offense has played for most of this season and how Jameis Winston has historically played against the Falcons, and given how the Falcons defense has played for most of this season, that if the offense, this is going to be a game where the Falcons are going to need their offense to put up some points if they're going to try to find a way to win it. But I know, as you just mentioned, there are many people out here that have no interest in the Falcons winning this game. But what are some of the matchups that you're going to be focused on, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I'm too very interested in that one. Like you said, Vita Vea has really come on strong of late. Gerald McCoy is still Gerald McCoy, and I think the Wes Schweitzer injury is probably the biggest, roster storyline going into this week, just because, I tweeted earlier that this could be the opportunity to get Matt Gano into the game and see what he has to offer. I know Dan Quinn said that there's a chance that they look at him there. I believe left guard is where they've been giving him some reps the last couple of weeks, but at the same time, maybe this really isn't the matchup for him or the time for him to get in this game. And it's, it's best if you have a veteran in Ben Garland where, he's not playing well right now, but he has the experience, at least, that he's played against some of these high level guys before, that you can trust him a little bit better. And I think also too, I mean, he got in that one snap this past week in Carolina. And we talked about this on the show last week. I'm not sure rotating a guard in like that on series is the best way, to get a guy into the game. Because again, going up against a guy like Kevin Love opposite you that has had a couple snaps already in the game, and you're coming in cold and you have to one play go up against him in a pass set. Again, I think you're just asking for disaster at times. Now, I know these guys are pros. It's their job to just come in there and be ready at all times. But again, for me, I never really liked that idea to begin with. So if Garland's in there and he's in there the whole game, I'm not totally down on the idea of him being in there and being able to be up to the task. And I think Alex Mack's going to have a huge game because of that too. I mean, helping out those guys because they are going to be a load to deal with. So again, putting in an inexperienced guy like, maybe isn't the best idea. Maybe we should pump the brakes on that because again, having now your sixth guard in there, six different guard next to Mac, going up against those two guys, I don't know if that's the greatest idea. But then,
yeah. Go
on. Sorry, my bad.
Well, I was going to say, Garland, even though he's had good performances against Carolina in the past, for the most part, he tends to struggle against big, powerful D tackles, and that's basically what Carolina's
Wait. Didn't we have a discussion before on Twitter about him holding his own against Kawan Short in the past?
In one game for one quarter, he did.
Hey, you made a pretty big deal about that one game.
I did, because that was how I could win that argument. If I look at the rest of the sample size, then typically he tends to struggle against bigger D tackles, and Carolina is basically nothing but 320-pound guys. Right. So that probably isn't necessarily the best matchup for him. And you can argue maybe having a guy like Vita Vea is probably not going to be a great matchup for him. Gano is going to be interesting because he didn't really play guard at college, but he was projected to do so when he got to the pros because he doesn't necessarily have sort of the ideal size that people in bulk that people typically like for their offensive tackles, where the average starter is like 6'5", 315 at offensive tackle, and Gano was like 6'4.5", maybe like 305 or something like that. So, a lot of people looked at him as guard, but when he played as a guard in that All-Star game, I don't know how he looked in practices because I wasn't there, but whatever that All-Star game was, which was one of like the low-key ones, I think the All-American Bowl or whatever it is.
Yeah.
He was didn't look great. He played some tackle and guard, and didn't look as good at guard as he did at tackle for obvious reasons, because he played tackle 4 years in college and played no guard. And then to not have him play guard during the preseason, unless I'm misremembering something, but basically he was exclusively playing, right tackle this past summer. I think throwing him to the Wolves this week against Vea, who's coming on strong, who brings that power element, and Gerald McCoy, who's still Gerald McCoy, even if he's not Gerald McCoy. I think you're right. That was a long way of me saying that I agree with you in the sense that this is probably not the game that you want to throw him in the lineup just for the sake of kicking it around, because I think everything is sort of pointing away from him having success, given the lack of experience at guard, given the competition. So I think, if Garland goes in and struggles, then I certainly think at that point you don't really necessarily have an alternative, better option. And then at that point you can maybe at least give Gano a series and see what he can do. But Yeah,
Now, would you in that scenario, because I think the one thing that Sombrilo, I think going forward, kind of offers is he has some flexibility. I think to slide inside. They've dabbled with him in practices and whatnot, and I think maybe even in the preseason. I can't remember. Would you be more comfortable sliding Sombrilo into one of the guard spots and have Gano? I mean, at that point, you have to make some changes mid-game if guys are struggling. Or do you think you'd rather give Gano the work at guard, even though, like we've talked about, and I agree with you, I think he has looked better, is more comfortable at tackle. What's your thoughts there as far as Garland struggles? You're putting Gano there, or you're sliding Sombrilo over?
Well, I think if you're arguing me, who would I rather get snaps this week, Gano or Ryan Schrader? In that scenario, I would probably go with Ryan Schrader.
Oh wait, yeah, I didn't even think of that. I was actually gonna say, yeah, duh, yeah, you'd put Ryan Schrader at right tackle, and then
yeah. So
Ryan
if you slid Sambrelo inside to guard and put Schrader there, that makes if you're trying to get the best 5 guys on
right.
the field, that seems to make more sense than putting Gano. But I think if you have him out there, if Schweitzer is inactive, then Gano's going to be active, which is not. I don't think he's been active at all this season. So you have that opportunity to insert him into the lineup in some form or fashion if you want to at least give him a look. But in terms of like, oh, we need to play him, like, no. I mean, like that to me is tanking at this point, like where you would overlook, not only Schweitzer being injured and Ryan Schrader, who's, started what, I don't know, like 70 games for you, and you would be like, yeah, let's throw Matt Gano into this situation and see what he can do. That just seems to me like you're probably not doing that with the idea of trying to get the best possible guys on the field.
I think too, though, if they did do that and they bypassed Schrader and put Gano in the game, I think that would all but assure that you're moving on from Schrader next year, and that would be a reason then. I mean, you want to see what Gano can do in live snaps in a real game, so that you can have a better sense or more tape to evaluate going forward in 2019 of, is this guy someone we want to keep getting an extended look at? Or, because again, I mean, he's an undrafted free agent. It's not like these guys are necessarily tied to the team going forward. So, just give them a better idea of what they have if he does get in the game. Because again, I think a lot of us are wondering what they're going to do with Schrader going forward. I mean, he has $3.8 million of dead money coming either way, and they can split that up. But I just find it hard to believe that they might turn to him again. But again, if guys struggle, maybe they do, and then maybe that's his opportunity to get back into things, and maybe they do bring him back at a restructured rate next year, and he gets one last shot. But that's one scenario where I can see, well, all right, if they're bypassing Schrader, then they're pretty much done with him, and they want to get an idea of what Gano can offer for the future, maybe.
Well, the question I would ask you, if let's say whether it's right tackle or left guard or whatever, you put Gano in the game and he plays well.
Yeah.
Does that mean now you're going to bypass taking an offensive lineman in the first round or the second round?
No, not necessarily. I mean, it's a guy then that, whether it's competition, then it's an open competition going forward between Gano, a draft pick, and Sombrilo, then maybe that's where you're at then with that. And, again, I'd have some apprehension there. I think we all would, but if those two guys have played well, then, I mean, I think they deserve that opportunity.
Look, if Gano's going to be part of the competition, I think, the OTAs is an opportunity for him to prove that. But I think, whatever he does, if he plays in this game, I don't think it's a big enough sample size, whether he plays well or plays poorly, to really determine how that's going to factor in his. Like, I just think right now he's just kind of a non-factor as far as your future plans are. So playing him, while it would certainly benefit him in terms of his development, so that he can get, quote unquote live ammunition, fired at him before the season is up. But in terms of like it changing or affecting how the Falcons approach their offseason, So, like, to basically you saying, like, giving Gano some opportunity so that you can sort of see what he can do and possibly make a more informed decision about whether you're going to move on from Schrader. I just don't know, one game from Gano, good or bad, is going to affect that decision. I think that decision is going to be based off of other factors and basically whether or not you think you can find a better player than Ryan Schrader this offseason.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the other guys, because I was going to bring up, guys like Isaiah Oliver and, Russell Gage is even getting more action now at wide receiver. They're getting extended looks for more evaluation for 2019. Do you not? I mean, I guess those guys are in a different category for you then, as far as why they're getting snaps and why getting Matt Gano snaps would mean nothing.
Well, I think it's a little different because Gage is basically filling in at that X wide receiver spot for the 20% of snaps, which is what, like 5 pass plays over the course of a game that Julio Jones is on the sideline.
So it has to do with the injury, then, you're saying, probably.
No, I just think you can mix in a wide receiver or a cornerback into the lineup much more easily than an offensive lineman. Like you can, like you.
Well, sure, but my point is he wasn't getting those snaps several weeks ago, but he's getting them now because I think they're at a point in the season where they want to evaluate these guys.
Yeah, and my point is it's easier to get him 5 snaps here, 10 snaps here, 15 snaps here to help evaluate him. It's a lot different to do that with an offensive lineman because basically, generally speaking, offensive linemen play every single snap. So you either got to go all in or nothing.
But then why? I mean, again, I talked about not liking the Garland Beatles musical chairs game, but they've been doing it with them. I mean, I guess doing it with a younger guy is different, but I don't know. Again, if it comes to the point where someone's struggling ahead of them, I can easily see, because I think they know what Schrader's going to offer you. So it's not like anything's going to change with him. It's just a matter of, hey, where do these other guys stand? Are we comfortable with a duo of Sembrilo and Gano plus a draft pick and a free agent at tackle next year? Or is Gano maybe not it based on a year of practice plus preseason plus, a chunk of snaps in this last game here to then say, all right, well, maybe then it's back to Sembrilo and Schrader and someone that they bring in. So I don't know. I don't think it hurts in that case if guys are struggling ahead of them to get this guy in the game just to see what he can offer. Because again, my next question for you is, regardless, do you think he's like, what's the percentages Gano is back in the picture? Pretty high then for you? I mean, you think you're not going to just...
No, look, I agree with you. If we get to this game and JPP and Vea and McCoy are cooking Beatles and Sambrelo and Garland and Schweitzer or whoever, then putting Gano in the game at that point, makes sense, just to be like, well, you can't do worse than what the other guys are doing.
Right.
But in terms of being in the picture, I mean, to be on the roster or be in the picture to be competing for a starting spot?
Well, just in the roster. And I mean, if you're on the roster, then there's a shot that you're going to be competing, whether it's swing tackle or...
I mean, like, I think his ceiling is a swing tackle next year. And I think that's probably being based off of what we saw in the preseason, being generous for him to win that spot. So,
because again, at that point, a swing tackles, that's your third tackle, right? It's not, you're not talking your fourth tackle. So how can you get to that point with Gano without at least seeing him in live action? Because right now, I'd say the swing tackle is Ty Sembralo at the very, in 2019. I mean, he's proven the last 3 weeks, and Quinn's talked him up, and rightfully so, that he deserves a shot to come back to at least be that swing tackle. So if that's not the case, then you're talking about just bringing him back for the fourth tackle. And, what progress have you made on his development then?
Well, I mean, look, the jump from year 1 to year 2 is a big one. So I don't necessarily feel like you have to play Gano this week in order for him to have a shot at winning that spot next summer. Now, again, if you bring back Sembralo and he's, and presumably whether it's Schrader or a draft pick or a free agent or whatever it is, you have another option there to start over Sembralo. and sort of your Jake Matthews, your left tackle, some other person is your presumptive right tackle. Sambrailo is the front runner to be your swing tackle, and then Gano is basically pushing Sambrailo for that spot or competing to be the fourth tackle on the roster or the ninth offensive lineman, the 10th offensive line, whatever it is. I feel comfortable with him having that opportunity without him playing. I mean, right now I just don't think that there's anything he can do like he could come in and play well and be like, oh well, maybe he could realistically beat out Sambrailo for the swing tackle spot, but I just don't think there's anything he can do in this game that's going to really move the needle one way or the other on his future or the team's future at that offensive tackle or the offensive guard position. I just think right now he's a body at this point that could turn into something good, but I think if you move forward expecting him to be something good and basically pass up drafting or signing a guard or a tackle or whatever, just because of the glimpse that you got of Matt Gano in in a relatively meaningless Week 17 game, I think would be pretty foolish at this point. So I think at this point, I don't really have expectations for Gano. I just think he'll be on the roster and, he has an opportunity to compete for something next summer. What that is, I think we'll find out next summer.
It's all fair. Yeah, I guess as far as the other kind of thing I'm curious about with this matchup, Jameis Winston's notorious Falcons killer. It's pretty crazy. I went back and looked at his splits against Falcons versus all other teams. He has 16 touchdown passes against the Falcons. The next closest team is 7. It's the Panthers and the Saints, which obviously he's played the most against as well. So, I'm curious. He's been careless with the football this year. I mean, he's been kind of a gunslinger his whole career. Except I guess when he plays the Falcons, but the Falcons now these last couple games have been very optimistic, have been getting after the football. So, I'm curious to see if they can continue it and maybe force Jameis into those turnovers as well. I mean, they did force him into 2 turnovers, 2 interceptions in the first matchup. KZ and I believe Brian Poole was the other one, right? If I'm not mistaken, in the end zone, I want to say. So again, I'm going to be curious about Jameis Winston versus the Falcons secondary as far as can they get their hands on the football, or do we have a potential shootout on our hands because both these defenses don't offer a lot of resistance, especially going up against the more high-powered offenses. And I think the Falcons and the Bucs are 2 of those this year. I think that's the one thing that people probably are overlooking about this Bucs team, since they have been pretty terrible, is the fact that their offense is moving the football and can have the potential to put up points. Their last matchup against the Cowboys, there was a couple opportunities in the red area where they did not take advantage of. But again, this is a matchup where I can see could reach the 30s if the offenses get going. So that's kind of the other thing I'm looking for, is how can the Falcons finally slow down Jameis Winston? Because this could very well be Jameis's last game in Tampa Bay. So it would be nice for his final game in Tampa as a Buccaneer to finally, solve the riddle that is Jameis Winston, because they haven't done it thus far.
Yeah. If you guys go the Pro Football Reference, look at Jameis's numbers against it's ridiculous. Like,
it's crazy.
His adjusted net yards per attempt is 8.3, which is basically like elite, all-time elite. 8.3 I think Mahomes is like 8.7. I think Breeze is like 8.5 this year. But like Matt Ryan is like 7.5, and he's having a quote unquote MVP caliber season. So basically, Jameis is an elite quarterback and an MVP caliber quarterback, at least based off of the numbers when he plays the Falcons. And then when you look at his splits against pretty much every other team, all the other 30 NFL teams, they're pretty terrible. He wishes he could be Eli Manning against those teams. So it's fascinating how he seems to get up for these games. And, so the key is going to be the Falcons getting pressure on him, which they haven't historically done a great job, even in that previous matchup. I think they did a better job than they have done in previous outings, but I don't think the pressure was really there to really give Jameis too many problems in that game. And I think, hopefully we can see this trend up with the defensive line the last couple of weeks, with Bruce Irvin getting involved, with Tack being more productive. The two biggest weaknesses on the Bucs offensive line are right guard Caleb Beninock, who's terrible, and left tackle Donovan Smith, who is my arch nemesis on Twitter. Historically, Vic Beasley has had success against DeMar Dotson in the past. So that is another matchup that the Falcons could potentially exploit. And I know Ryan Jensen hasn't had the greatest season, but he's a center, and necessarily, other than Deidrin Sanat, you're not going to get too many one-on-ones against him. And of course, Ali Marpet is a really good left guard. But I think, Jared against Beninock, if we can get some of that NASCAR rush where Tack goes inside and faces Beninock, he usually lines up on the left side when he does do that. So I do think those are some favorable matchups for the Falcons, and maybe get some pressure on Jameis and create some of those turnovers where he starts to force some throws and do typical Jameis stuff that he historically hasn't done quite against the Falcons defense.
Yep, I agree. I think the D-line will have a lot to say about whether, this is a high-scoring game or, they can kind of hold their own and maybe keep them under 20, and that should be good enough for the Falcons offense and the team as a whole to get a W.
All right. You want to move on to the mailbag?
Sounds good to me.
All right. First question comes from Brian at your homeboy Brian on Twitter. He asks, how disgusted would you guys be personally if the Saints won the Super Bowl in our house? Do you think most of the Falcons players, coaches, or Arthur Blank would be disgusted? Your thoughts?
So I can't really speak for them personally, but I know for myself, yeah, I would be. I was saying to a couple friends here, if the Saints win the Super Bowl in Atlanta, that would pretty much wrap up a 3-year personal nightmare for myself. Whereas, obviously in 2016, we know what happened with the Falcons. 2017, being that I'm from, the Philly area, and, the Eagles are actually probably my most disliked team, and the Saints are right after that. Eagles winning the Super Bowl in 2017, and then the Saints to then follow it up and win in 2018. That would just be absolute devastation for me personally. So, yeah, I would be disgusted. Hopefully it doesn't happen. But, unfortunately, I kind of feel like at the very least, I think they're going to get there, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, as far as the team, I mean, I'm sure Arthur Blank doesn't want to see the rival team in his building hoisting the Lombardi. So yeah, I'm sure a little bit he'd be disappointed and disgruntled, but again, I can't really speak for them. So, but for me personally, yes, it would be disappointing.
I don't think the players and coaches would be particularly disgusted, at least certainly compared to the fan base. I think the fans, take this much more personally than certainly the players and coaches do. I'm sure they wouldn't be thrilled about it, but I don't think they're going to lay in bed for 3 hours Monday morning after the Super Bowl, be like, oh, I can't get out of bed. The Saints won last night,
Yeah.
I wouldn't. I can only speak for myself. I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to get up that Monday morning, go to work, just like it's a normal day. But obviously, I wouldn't be thrilled about it. But it wouldn't necessarily be like the worst thing that's ever happened to me. It's one of those things where it would be unfortunate, and you're right. It would sort of complete the trifecta. Although I don't have as big an issue of the Eagles winning that Super Bowl as you do, Matt. And in fact, I celebrated the Eagles winning the Super Bowl because to me that's the closest a bird team I will root for will ever win a Super Bowl against the hated Patriots. But it is what it is. You can't really control it. I mean, basically, if I got upset every time the Saints managed to outdo the Falcons, the last decade plus would have been really rough for me, and you got to just find a way to overcome it, adapt and overcome, as they say. Justin Sandu asks, thoughts on how Grady Jarrett contract negotiations play out?
So I think the first thing that we should probably clear up is, there was a report from Dave Archer, I guess over the weekend, where he kind of scared the fan base a little bit, saying that Jarrett and the Falcons are not in the same ballpark or not in the same zip code or something. Now, he did then later backtrack on that statement and kind of say that he doesn't really know a whole lot. He was kind of, I guess, just speculating himself, like we all often do on Twitter. So I don't think, this is in dire straits yet where they're not going to get a long-term deal reached sometime this offseason. I think we're ways away from that point. But what I will say is that I can see them, not agreeing to a long-term deal, and they do take the franchise tag route, which I didn't think was a possibility early on. But, the longer things go, and I think, too, the one thing that people should keep in mind, and the reason the deal hasn't gotten done this season is, the Falcons only have, last I checked, and this was a couple of days ago, like 1.2 million left in salary cap space, according to the NFL Players Association website. So with that being said, 1.2 million isn't enough to get a deal done where, part of the signing bonus will hit this year and then the rest of it hits the following years. And that's kind of how deals, at least extensions mid-season, kind of go about. Because again, Jarrett's only on, $1.9 million salary. So any extension he would get would all but raise his current salary cap hit. So it's not doable for that reason alone this season. So that's why, we haven't seen anything. Now, come the off season, when the new league year hits, that's a different ball game. Then they have, by my count, they have about 30 million right now. I think they can create a whole bunch more. So at that point, it just comes down to, can they agree on what Grady Jarrett's market value is? Now, Spot Track does a pretty decent job of kind of calculating market values for players. And right now, Grady's been in that $15 million range, which, is with the likes of Malik Jackson, Jarrell Casey, some of the good defensive tackles in this league. Not quite, the J.J. Watts, the Aaron Donalds. I think those contracts and people, and that's another thing that people, wanted to talk about is, does Grady Jarrett want Aaron Donald money? Even if he did, Aaron Donald, that type of contract, I think, is an outlier contract. I don't think any defensive player after him, at least right now in the league, is going to touch that type of salary, at least from a defensive tackle standpoint. Edge rusher, that's kind of a different ball game. But from a defensive tackle standpoint, that 20 plus million that Donald's making, we don't have to worry about that with Grady Jarrett. So I guess long story short, I think this is either, Grady Jarrett gets the franchise tag at that 15.355 million it's projected right now in 2019. Or I think, we're just getting kind of worked up for nothing, and you do see a long-term deal get reached, and I think it's going to be in that ballpark of the 15, 16 million. So again, I don't think there's any reason to panic. I think either way, Grady Jarrett's getting his long-term money, or he'll be on a one-year franchise tag, which I still think they'll have plenty of room to make other moves, even with that price tag in 2019.
Piggyback on a point you made about making in-season extensions. I don't know the exact deadline for it, but there is a deadline at some point, I think, like in December, where like you can't sign a guy to an in-season extension and have it count this year or next year or something. There's some weird deadline. So there's a certain window where you can get an in-season extension done. I think it's ends around late November or early December.
And that would make sense because that's when like Schrader and Alford got
their I think they were like mid-November, early November when they got their deals done. So basically, I think the point of that is just basically getting a deal done with Grady Jarrett has been off the table for at least a couple of weeks, if not a couple of months. And from what we heard earlier in the season, once the season started, the Falcons and Grady Jarrett and his representation basically weren't really trying to get something done, from what I hear. That being said, this was something I talked about during the summer when we had that slate of signings with Ricardo Allen and Jake Matthews. And then to me, the question was whether or not Grady Jarrett and the Falcons were on the same page with his market value, because I think there was an expectation that, the Falcons might want to sign Grady Jarrett to something like what Timmy Jernigan got from Philadelphia last year, which was about $12.5 million. But then and I said this on the podcast, but it's like, if I'm Grady Jarrett and his agent, I'm like, I want to be the highest paid D tackle in the NFC South. And that means I want more money than Jared McCoy got. That's more money than K'Wan Short got, which is give me something in the north of 16 million. So, with the Ricardo Allen deal and the Jake Matthews deal, I don't feel like there was as much potential for negotiation between the two parties, because, once Nate Solder got his deal, we kind of knew what Jake Matthews was going to get. And I think, Ricardo Allen, given his circumstances with DeMonte Casey peaking behind him, he didn't necessarily have the leverage to basically get the max deal that a safety in his position could have gotten. So we got him for relatively cheaper, a lot cheaper than sort of what the market might have dictated for him. That's not the case with Grady Jarrett. Grady Jarrett kind of has the Falcons over a barrel, so he can basically ask for whatever he wants. And when it comes to the franchise tag, if the Falcons do wind up tagging him and that tag winds up being about $15 million or so, that's going to be a major limiting factor on the Falcons' ability to spend, because we know historically that when they have been active in free agency, they've usually had cap space in the $25+ million range. And if they're set at 30, you take 15 away from that for the franchise tag. Now they're at 15. So then they would have to then make moves to create another 10 to 15 million more. So and then that will, have an effect on what potential moves that they would wind up making in order to create that cap space. Or they might be a little bit more conservative in free agency than I think a lot of people, including myself, hope that they will be. As for where his contract gets settled, again, I'll put on the agent hat again. But if you assume that Grady Jarrett's going to get that $15 million franchise tag, and then if the Falcons didn't get a new deal done with him before now and the July 15th deadline, they would potentially have to tag him again. But that would be then a 20% increase. So that would be an $18 million franchise tag in 2020. That's basically $33 million plus, give or take, a couple $100,000 that he would be owed if he just basically refused to sign a contract over the next 2 years. So, you do the math on that 33 over 2 years, that's $16.5 million, which again is Kawan short money. So like if the Falcons are basically not willing to pay him at least $16-17 million, I think Fletcher Cox is the second highest paid D tackle with the 17 point something million dollars from the Eagles after Donald's 22, then I think Grady Jarrett and his agent are completely justified to basically just chill out until they get 16, 17, $18 million. And, I think that they have the leverage to basically play the long game and not sign something unless it comes into that range. Unless the Falcons are going to draft somebody to replace Grady Jarrett, which is, I guess, possible given this year's D tackle class. They're kind of stuck, and I don't think they really want to be in the business of getting rid of arguably their best defensive lineman, arguably their most reliable pass rusher anytime soon. So I think, all that being said is I do think eventually the Falcons will acquiesce to whatever Grady Jarrett's demands are, which again, I think will probably be in that 16, 17, maybe even as high as $18 million range when all is said and done.
See, the thing that I was kind of toying with now, again, we talked about Pro Bowls last week on the show. Where do you think, because I think a lot of this leverage game and the negotiation game comes down to how the rest of the league also views a certain player. And, again, we talked last week about the Pro Bowls. They need to clean up their system because guys that deserve to be in don't necessarily get in. But as far as where you think Grady Jarrett ranks amongst the rest of the D tackles in football, because again, you're talking about him crossing guys that have been 4-time Pro Bowlers that are considered widely the top 3 and 4 at the position. Do you think Grady Jarrett necessarily has that leverage over the Falcons, or the Falcons can say, Grady, you're a great player. You're maybe 7 to 8 best defensive tackle in football. Let's get we're gonna stick with this $15 to $16 million valuation because that's where guys like Kawan Short and Jarrell Casey and Malik Jackson are falling. And those guys, again, multiple time Pro Bowlers, widely considered tops at their position. Is Grady Jarrett widely considered around the league to be in that same realm? Because that's where I think the Falcons don't necessarily, they're not over the barrel as much as, I think, you may be making it out to be.
Well, here's what I will say. This year, Grady Jarrett is the highest graded D tackle in the NFC South. I think he's like top 5.
Right, he's like He's fourth, I think, right now in defense.
Pro Football Focus. So I think whether, like, to me, I don't think Pro Bowls.
Now, our team. Do you think agents and players are using that then?
I think agents and players use whatever they got to. So I think if and for some agents, oh, my guy went to the Pro Bowl, pay me, like I'm a top 5 guy, and other agents will be like, well, my guy didn't go to Pro Bowl, but he should have because he was graded as a top 5 guy on Pro Football Focus, so pay me. So I think agents will use whatever leverage they can get, and again, I just don't think the Falcons really at this point in time, given their defensive line issues, can really afford to basically be like play hardball with Grady Jarrett just to save, I don't know, like $2 million a year or whatever over the next 3 or 4 years. What's the difference between giving him 15 million and 17 million? It's not that much. I mean, it all boils down to the guaranteed money, and I'm not going to sit here and speculate how much guaranteed money. I haven't really looked at that, but yeah, so I think that stuff, agents will use whatever they can to negotiate the best deal for their clients.
Yeah, and I mean, that is a good point. It really comes down to the guaranteed money, not necessarily per year. So, just looking at some of the contracts, guaranteed money, Fletcher Cox, $63.29 million. Marcel Darius got $60 million. Gerald McCoy got 51.5. So, I mean, that's probably where the bulk of the negotiation is going to lie. And that kind of determines how many years really a player is locked into their deal. So, yeah, I think, again, you're right. I mean, if we're talking per year, that's probably not as relevant as what the guaranteed money is going to be. So, yeah, I can easily see it reaching 17, 18. And at that point, again, they don't have a lot. You don't want your best defensive player leaving town. So, again, I think when it's all said and done, Jarrett's going to be a Falcon long term. They said as much even in the off season that he's a priority, and it's just a matter of right now. It seems like it's agreeing on a value, and eventually they'll come to terms on that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Dave Archer's report, like if he is, and again, you explained sort of pretty accurately, I think, sort of how that situation went down. But let's just play hypothetical that if he is asking for, Aaron Donald money and asking for $20 million a year, obviously I don't think the Falcons are going to pay that.
And I don't think any team really would.
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, if Grady Jarrett and his agent are asking for that, which again, if you can, there's no harm in asking for it, right? If you can get the Falcons to give you that money, then why not ask for it? There's no harm in that. But I think at the end of the day, if the Falcons wind up, coming up to $17 million and offering Grady Jarrett that, and 35, 40, $50 million guaranteed, I would just have a hard time believing that Grady Jarrett and his representation would turn down that contract. So I do think if they are asking for Aaron Donald money, which again is unlikely given what we've heard, but I think that's a good negotiating tactic just to get the Falcons to come up on a little bit to get the best offer that you would not necessarily get if your starting point was like 16 million a year or something like that. So I do think this will get resolved, but obviously, to me, once we got to the bye week and the contract wasn't signed, it sort of signaled to me that at least the franchise tag would be a possibility. So I still think it's a possibility. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, they'll definitely get a deal done. I have no idea. So I would say at this point, the franchise tag is a realistic possibility. But in the meantime, I do think whether it's in March or whether it's in July, I do expect Grady Jarrett to have a long-term deal before the start of the 2019 season.
Yeah, I agree. It's all about just meeting in the middle, and I think eventually that will happen.
Justin's next question is, what percentage chance would you put on Ty Sambrailo being the starting right tackle in 2019, a.k.a. Aaron's worst nightmare?
I'd put it maybe like, I don't know, 10, 15%. I think, again, if he has another good game this week, that makes 4 for the season. It's a quarter of the year. I think at the very least, like we talked about earlier, he's in line to be that swing tackle. And after that, it's just a matter of, what the Falcons do in the offseason in free agency and the draft. I mean, I've been advocating them take one of these tackles in free agency, whether it be Trent Brown from the Patriots or Jawan James from Miami. Hopefully both of those guys, make it out of there and are on the market. And I think the Falcons could have enough money to reasonably get both of those guys to come back home and return home to Georgia, where they're from. So if that happens, then I think, that bumps those odds down even lower. I think those guys then plug and play right tackle. Now, if that doesn't happen and you go into the draft, then I think, all bets are off a little bit. You could say at that point you're handicapped into taking a tackle in the first round, whether it be Jonah Williams or, depending on how some of these other guys rise, like Yadni Kajus from West Virginia, or maybe Cody Ford from Oklahoma, if they light up the combine, maybe they take them, or, maybe those guys are available in round 2. But at that point, I think, with a rookie going up against a veteran who's been on the team now for going on his 3rd year, I think there's a competition there somewhat. I mean, the expectation is that rookie is the plug and play guy, but there's no certainty ever with draft picks. So I think at that point, if you're going into the draft taking a tackle, the odds of Sombrilo playing and starting go up a little bit. So yeah, I mean, the percentages are arbitrary. I'll say 15 or so, but it all depends on what they do in the off season and how they approach the tackle position, really.
I would like to say that the percentage is 0, but I know that's not true. Basically similar thoughts as what Matt just shared. I think it depends. Obviously, I think the Falcons will have 2 opportunities to clearly make a upgrade, or I don't know if it's an upgrade, but a move at the right tackle position to get a guy that is firmly the starting guy, or at least the guy who's expected to be the starter. And it can, injuries happen and all those sorts of things and whatnot. So you never know. But free agency is one. The issue is, I think Matt just named probably the 2 main guys that you would definitely sign in free agency and be like, oh yeah, that guy's definitely the starter. There's a couple other guys that you might sign to like 1-year prove-it deals, like Ty and Seki or whatnot. But for the most part, it's a limited sample of free agent offensive tackles, and looking at some of the veterans that are at least on the potential bubble, it doesn't look overly promising there that you're going to have this wide group of guys. So the issue with that is that's going to potentially drive up the price of guys, where you have the supply doesn't necessarily meet the demand. So we'll see how that gets played out. The other option is obviously taking an offensive tackle in the first round, which if you want a plug-and-play starting offensive tackle, typically that's when you need to take a guy in the top 20 or so picks. There isn't a high number of successful guys that were late first-round picks or second-round picks that come into the league right away and become starters and their success. There are some. You get guys like Ryan Ranchek and Mitchell Schwartz and other guys. But it's not necessarily a regular occurrence. For every one of those guys, there's like 2 or 3 or 4 of those guys that don't come in and hit the ground running. And so then your other option is taking a guy later in the draft on day 2, which is more of a developmental guy. And I think if that's the case, then the chances that Ty Sambrailo opens the season as a starter go up quite a bit due to the fact that, again, going back to what I just said, those guys typically don't come into the league hitting the ground running. Maybe the Falcons get lucky and get a guy like Kajust or Ford or David Edwards or somebody else that I don't know of right now that will be on their radar and turn into that next Mitchell Schwartz type of guy. But again, that's not necessarily what normally occurs. So I would say my expectation is that the Falcons will try to plug and play with a free agent if they do decide to cut Ryan Schrader. I'm not convinced that is definitely going to happen, but there are strong signs to indicate that is the direction that they're leaning towards. I just feel like that's the best strategy moving forward, is to try to solve it in free agency so that you're not going and throwing a rookie to the wolves, and he's going to be forced to face guys like Cameron Jordan and J.J. Watt, and depending on how the Falcons finish, Michael Bennett and Daniil Hunter and some of these superstars potentially next season, and having Matt Ryan just basically, just terrible things being happened to him. So, I think that's probably the best strategy moving forward. But we'll have to see. I think I do expect Ty Sambrailo to be back on the roster next season. Whether he's starting, I think more than likely the Falcons will sort of pencil him in as the presumptive favorite to be the swing tackle. And based off of these last couple of games, they'll be like, well, if we have to start him, we know that he's okay. And that's basically like starting Sambrailo is like their plan C, not necessarily their plan A or B.
And I think, too, people have to keep in mind that this draft class is much better along the interior than it is at tackle. I mean, we talked about kind of the 3 or 4 names at tackle, but there's 10 to 15, I think, interior guys that have versatility to play center and guard. So with that in mind, and also keeping in mind that I think they likely need to replace/upgrade 2 spots on this offensive line this offseason. I think you need to get one of them probably in free agency and one of them in the draft, because again, you talked about how to expect an rookie offensive lineman early on to be a capable starter or starter period, I think is kind of unrealistic. So for me, I think you have to get at least one of them in free agency and the other one in the draft. And I think, again, because of the fact that the class is stronger and deeper on the interior, I think that's where you go get your guard/center, future center maybe, in the draft. And then in free agency, I think you have to kind of, back up the money truck a little bit and, hopefully not overspend, because you'd like to be a little bit productive elsewhere, hopefully along the defensive line too in free agency if they can. But yeah, I think they definitely have to shore up one of those spots in free agency. And I think tackle makes the most sense this year.
Brian asks, do you think Matt Ryan has much say on if Sark will stay in 2019 or on who his replacement would be? I get the impression Matt Ryan thinks Sark is doing good. When listening to a press conference about a month ago, Matt might go to bat for Sark if he feels he's not the problem.
I don't think he does have say. I think this kind of question came up, or this question was posed to him back when Shanahan had left for San Francisco. No, and they basically said that he wasn't involved in the process at all. Am I right?
No, that's correct.
Remembering that right? So yeah, I think the same thing would apply this year. I think it's going to be Dan Quinn and Thomas Dimitrov's call. So, again, I'm on the record of saying I don't want to see really any of the coordinators let go. I think the bigger issues stem much further. I think they stem from a personnel standpoint and just the simple fact that the players didn't hold their end of the bargain in certain situations this year during that 5-game losing streak, and even earlier in the season, with the defense. But I think that early on can be attributed more to the injuries and the younger guys kind of finding out their roles on the defense. But yeah, for me, I think, I don't really want to see Matt Ryan have to go through his 5th coordinator in his 12th season. I think they've made strides this year on the offensive side of the ball. I think they've improved the red zone conversion rate. They went from 49% last year to, top 10, 63% this year. And, the efficiency metrics continue to be, in the upper echelon, top 7 in the league as far as, plays per drive, yards per drive, points per drive success rate, which measures, how often, a play results in a first down or a touchdown. They're top 7 there. So for me, I think Sark has done some good things. Matt Ryan, this is his 2nd best season of his entire career, best touchdown to interception ratio. So for me, Sark's not holding some of these guys back. I mean, at least, not guys like Matt Ryan and Julio Jones and the focal points of the offense. I mean, you can say that maybe Tevin Coleman wasn't featured as properly in the pass game, but I think that's nitpicking for certain aspects. For me, I think these guys need to come back. I think continuity is important. So I hope it doesn't happen, but if it does, no, I don't think Matt's going to be involved in the process. And, hopefully they get someone that has similar philosophies and it's not a full-blown scheme change again, because Matt did talk about how, it was like going from speaking English to speaking French, this change in scheme. So for him to have to do that again in year 12, it's almost like you're, agreeing to take 2 steps or take 1 step back in order to take maybe 1.5 steps improvement going forward. So I don't think it's worth it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think to add on to that, Matt doesn't have a say in terms of like if Dan Quinn or whoever goes to him like, what do you think about whether or not we should like? He doesn't have that, but he does have a say, so to speak, in terms of Dan Quinn and obviously whoever else is having input on that decision making process. Presumably Thomas Dimitroff and Arthur Blank will weigh in, but the final decision falls on Dan Quinn. His say is as far as his interactions with Sark over the last 2 years and sort of his performance on the field. And so if Dan Quinn was sitting there, walking through Flowery Branch on his way to get, whatever he drinks, a Mountain Dew or whatever he does. I just imagine Dan Quinn drinks Mountain Dew. Then he would see like, issues between Matt Ryan and Steve Sarkisian. That would be sort of the thing that he would factor into, his decision-making process. But presumably there haven't been those issues. And clearly this season has shown that, you can criticize Sark for, certain things, aspects of the offense, but it doesn't seem to be holding back Matt Ryan in any major ways. Had his second best season statistically, and arguably you can make the case because of some of the issues Sark has as a play caller. He has done much more heavy lifting in this year's offense than he did in 2016 when he was much more productive statistically in certain areas. So I think, the product on the field is basically Matt having his say and being like, he's good with Sark. So I think in terms of like having a direct conversation with Matt Ryan about who does he think the offensive coordinator should be, that's just not going to happen. But in terms of, contributing to the conversation, contributing to the thought process by how he interacts with the coaching staff in the building and on the field, that's where his say is. And I think his say has been one that gives Sark a thumbs up.
Yeah, I just think, too many fans out there are on that never-ending pursuit of the offense that was 2016. And I think that's just where they're misguided. They call them historically great offenses for a reason. It's because they don't happen, so often. And with that, it was an outlier. I mean, everything just clicked. Everything just worked that year. And I don't think trying to replace and breaking up continuity for the sake of trying to reach to that point, I think you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. And that's why I've always been such a huge supporter of Steve Sarkisian, because I knew, I was in that same boat early on. I had visions of, this offense can return to that same point. But then, as we went on and as we've seen, how difficult it can be to adapt to a new situation and learn new personnel and stuff and the trials and tribulations that come with that. I mean, again, he's showing strides, and I think to dump that and to move on to try to, get a sense of that 2016 offense again, unless Kyle Shanahan's walking through that door, which it's not looking likely, I don't see the point, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was thinking about this earlier today. You can make the argument that Sark is the second best offensive coordinator the Falcons have had in the last 20 years. Now,
there you
go. I could go deeper into that and sort of why that is not as positive praise as it would seem to be, but like, because
you're saying the bar's low.
Well, I'm just basically saying like, the Falcons. I don't think the Falcons have had great offensive coordinators over the last 20 years, and I think it's basically a conversation, a debate between Cutter and Sark for the number 2 spot.
I guess the real question is, how far is that gap for you from Sark being the second best to, I'm assuming Cutter's the third best, right?
It's not far. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, that's why I say you can make an argument, because I don't necessarily have a strong enough take to go one way or the other in either guy's direction. Like I think there's justifications for putting Sark ahead. I think there's justifications for putting Cutter ahead. If only probably because Cutter was probably a little bit more consistent week to week than Sark has been. But like the highs, I think of Sark have been probably better than they were under Cutter. So, I think that's a whole nother conversation. But I just wanted to point that out. Like I don't think that means that Sark is doing a good job and it should definitely keep his job. But I think it does mean that the whole idea, the whole concept that the grass is always greener,
exactly,
doesn't, certainly at least in Atlanta, hasn't necessarily been the reality for 2 decades. So.
Right. So, and that's why too, like, unless you're getting Gary Kubiak, for me, it's Gary Kubiak or bust. Because if you're going to keep the same scheme and keep the ball rolling, you got to have a guy like that that's better at this offense than Steve Sarkisian is. And for me, the only other guy is Gary Kubiak. Because if you bring in someone else, what are the chances he's going to want to run exactly the type of offense Dan Quinn wants him to run? So, yeah, I mean, that's why I think you put it perfectly. The grass isn't always greener unless, if you get Gary Kubiak, then maybe it is. But, yeah, I mean, there's no guarantee that the guy that they bring in is going to be better. So,
yeah. All right, our last question comes from the New Jersey Falcons, Ronan at May2124 on Twitter. He asks, all of the various articles and blogs being written about the team point to all 3 coordinators getting let go, with Seattle offensive coordinator Darrell Bevell, Raheem Morris moving to defensive coordinator. Top reasonable names being mentioned. Thoughts?
So I kind of touched on this just in the last question, but for me, the only coordinator that I'd be an offensive coordinator I'd be okay with switching to is Gary Kubiak. Darrell Bevell to me is kind of just a lateral move. So yeah, I wouldn't be too happy with that. As far as defensive coordinator, again, I think Raheem Morris, it would be something similar. I think it would be a lateral move. For me, if they're going to shake up the defensive coordinator spot, I'd want it to be Dan Quinn just calling the shots, because I thought that, in the years that he's been here, they've had the most success with him there at that spot. So, again, if he's going to come to the realization that this defense isn't performing up to the standard that he has set, then who better to get them to that point than Dan Quinn himself, and say, all right, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down calling the shots, defensive coordinator. So again, if I don't want them to shake up any of these coordinator spots, maybe, other spots, further down on the coaching staff. I heard offensive line is getting tossed around quite a bit. I don't know what other ones really, maybe defensive line. But again, I think, I'd probably say, offensive line, if they can get a Rick Dennison, who's a guy that I think has had a lot of experience in that system, I would be okay with something like that happening. But I also think any coaching cut that they make, I think it's just viewed as a scapegoat, in my opinion, because, again, whether it's offensive line with Chris Morgan or defensive line with Bryant Young, sorry. I think a lot of it has to do with they just don't have the right personnel in those particular spots. So, we talked about it a lot the last couple of weeks. As far as offensive line, neglecting it in the draft the last several years, it's finally caught up to them. And kind of the same with the defensive line a little bit. I mean, they have addressed it somewhat in the fact that both their starting defensive ends are former first-round picks. But I think those first-round picks were given the keys to the car before that they were ready, or in Vic Beasley's case, maybe he was never ready for that spot, and they should have always supplemented him with more of a 3-down player, and Vic would be more just a nickel rusher. So to fire guys like Bryant Young and Chris Morgan, I think it's just them being scapegoats rather than them actually being the problem. So for me, I don't want any coaches cut, but the names that have been mentioned haven't been inspiring. So hopefully those aren't the guys that are hired, if that's the case. And if they are, then, again, I just think we're going to be talking about these same issues going forward unless they correct them with the personnel.
Yeah, look, I think, if the Falcons hire Darrell Bevel, I agree with Matt. I think it's mostly a lateral move. I'll just say this: like, I expect there to be a fire Bevel hashtag. You know, just
Almost instantly.
by week 3 of next season. So like that's not going to change. But like that's sort of Falcon fans. Like I have never known a Falcons offensive coordinator who has been looked at positively. That Falcon fans, a large percentage, if not the majority of Falcon fans, wanted to fire. That includes Kyle Shanahan, who hands down, is the best offensive coordinator and one of the best offensive minds in the league. But people wanted to get rid of him almost immediately when things weren't going the Falcons' way by the midpoint in that 2015 season. So, as far as firing coaches, I'm sort of in the same boat as Matt. I don't necessarily feel like coaches necessarily deserve to be fired. I think most of the defensive issues are due to the fact that the talent that, we've talked about this on this show, but the talent isn't quite to the degree that we thought it was going into the season on at some spots on that side of the ball, and injuries, undermining what talent was there, and so. But I do think at the same time, like I do think some heads are gonna have to roll for the Falcons finishing 6-10 or 7-9, whatever it is. I expect it to be 7-9 at this point, but I don't think that's just going to all be like, oh, everything's fine and we just got to replace these 3 or 4 starters, and that's the reason. That could be the narrative that the team decides to go with this offseason. But I also think you will see a couple of coaching changes, and I think one of the reasons, if for no other reason other than the fact that the Falcons aren't in the playoffs, means that they can be a little bit more active when certain, in that first week of January, when other staffs are being, cut loose, and so they can sort of pilfer some guys. And, part of the problem of being a postseason team is you can't really add to your coaching staff until after the season is over. And if that's in mid-January or late January, or of course, as it was 2 years ago in February, most of the good assistants have already gotten jobs. So I do think the Falcons will probably fire a couple of assistants, whether that's the coordinators or whether that's some position coaches. I have no idea. I don't think those decisions have been made yet in the slightest. I think those decisions, I'm sure Dan Quinn has a thought process in his head, but I don't think he's gone around telling people what he's planning on doing. That's not going to be a decision or a discussion that him or anybody in this organization is going to have until Sunday afternoon or Sunday night or even Monday morning. So, I think a lot of the sort of speculation is just that speculation, people connecting dots, which, this is the time of year where you do that. So I don't fault anybody for doing that. That's basically what Matt and I do on a daily basis on Twitter. But so I just don't, I wouldn't read too much into some of those rumors and articles and reports quite yet. But I think we will find out on Monday and in the week thereafter, that a couple of names on this coaching staff will be relieved of their duties moving forward. And who that is at this point, I have no idea. But I think some of the names. I think Chris Morgan might go.
Yeah, I can see that.
I think you probably will see at least one person on the DB, on the defensive backs. Probably the DB coach is that Doug Mallory?
Yeah, I think so.
I think he might go.
So you're thinking guys further down on the coaching staff? Then you don't think a coordinator change will happen?
I think if there is a coordinator change right now, I would expect it to be Marquand Manuel being relieved of his duties and be retained and being moved back to that secondary coach or being given the title of passing game coordinator or something like that, and then them hiring somebody who's not officially the defensive coordinator in title, but is sort of like one of the 2 or one of the 3 heads that basically is the defensive coordinator. So that's what I'm expecting, but again, that's just a guess.
Yeah, I kind of would have it something similar.
All right. There you have it, guys. That's another show in the books. We will be back next week to talk about what potential things might happen Monday morning or Tuesday or whenever that stuff goes down, and we'll know what the Falcons draft position is going to be.
Now, should we push it back later in the week, maybe because of that, and also because of the new year, or when?
Oh yeah, there's a holiday, isn't it? Yeah.
Same time next week.
Yeah, that probably makes sense. Let's do that.
I'm sure at that point there's probably going to be decisions made. You would think
something. I would imagine something has happened
by Thursday. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, let's do that. Let's plan on that. So we'll probably do a Thursday show again next week, and we'll talk whatever is going on with the Falcons at that point in time. And in the meantime, if you have any mailbag questions and you got a couple of days more to send them in, you can use the hashtag Falcons mailbag. Send them over to the show's Twitter handle, which is Falcons PFC. Of course, my Twitter handle is FalcFans. Matt's is Matt Karoly. That's Karoly. Of course, you should check us out on ProFootballCentral.com. You can also subscribe to the Pro Football Central YouTube page and make sure you hit that bell icon so you know when we go live. And of course, you can like us on Facebook. Falcon Central Radio is the name of the Facebook page where usually we simulcast, but not these last couple of weeks. Matt, I know you just recently dropped your part 2 of your off-season plan. When's sort of the ETA on part 3? Now that I know everybody, including myself, has read that part 2.
So we're probably shooting for, right after the national championship game, maybe right before Senior Bowl and stuff. Me and Raekwon Gilbert, who's helping me out, is my scouting buddy. Gonna go through some lists of day 1, 2, and day 3 prospects that the Falcons might be looking into at positions of need. So middle of January, I'd say roughly is when you can check that out at riseupbreeder.com. There
you have it. All right, guys. Appreciate everybody tuning in tonight. And again, we'll be back probably on a little bit of a delay next week to talk the end of the Falcon season. I'm sure by that point, no one's going to care about the Bucs game, but we might touch upon it a little bit at the very least. So until then.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everybody.